The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday morning, Harlan Voss had already told half of Cloverfield what it said. He stood outside the general store with his boots planted wide and his voice carrying the kind of satisfaction that men like him wore the way other men wore hats. Naturally, without thinking about it. Elias Vance, he announced to anyone pausing long enough to listen, spent good money on a mail-order wife, paid the agency out of billings, signed the papers, and now some woman's riding the Northern Pacific right this minute, thinking she's about to land herself a real rancher. He paused, let that settle. Poor fool doesn't even have enough cattle left to call it a ranch. Two men on the steps laughed. A woman crossing the street looked away. Harlan pulled the folded paper from his vest pocket. How it got there, he never explained, and tapped it against his palm. When she steps off that train and gets a look at what she married into, she'll be on the next one back east before sundown. He was still talking when Elias Vance walked past without stopping, without looking at him, without giving Harlan Voss the satisfaction of a single word. That restraint cost Elias more than people knew. If you've ever found yourself rooting for someone the whole world has already decided to count out, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end, because what happens next will surprise you. Hit that like button and drop a comment with the city or country where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The ranch had a name once. Elias's father had burned it into a cedar plank and nailed it above the gate the year he built the first fence post. Vance Hollow, it read, though the letters had faded now and the plank had warped so badly in the weather that you had to know what it said before you could read it. Elias had thought about replacing it a dozen times. He never did. Replacing it felt like admitting the old one was gone. He stood at the kitchen window the morning the letter arrived and watched his daughter, Maisie, chase the ranch's one remaining barn cat across the frozen yard. She was 8 years old and small for her age, with her mother's dark hair and a gap between her front teeth that made her look younger than she was. She caught the cat. Elias had no idea how. The animal was half wild. And she pressed her face into its fur and stayed there for a moment with her eyes closed. He looked away. The coffee on the stove had gone cold again. He'd poured it before dawn and forgotten it, the way he forgot things now. Not big things, small things. Coffee, meals, the date. The letter from the Billings matrimonial agency was on the table, already opened, the paper creased from where he'd folded and unfolded it too many times over the past 2 weeks. He didn't need to read it again. He had the important parts by memory. Miss Vivienne Hale, age 31. References provided upon request. Capable of household duties. Seeking a stable home in an honest frontier community. Capable of household duties. That was the phrase that had decided him, finally. Not love, not hope, not any of the things a younger man might have put first. He needed someone who could hold the household together while he worked. Someone Maisie could come home to. Someone who understood that life out here was not gentle, was not soft, was not a story from a magazine. He had written back. He had sent the agency fee, money he did not really have, and waited. Now she was on the train. He heard Maisie come in through the back door, the cat apparently abandoned, her boots leaving mud tracks across the floor he'd just swept. "Papa," she said, pulling off her coat and dropping it on the chair instead of the hook, which he noticed and decided not to mention. "Is she coming today?" "Train comes in at 2. "What if she's mean?" Elias turned from the window. "Then we'll deal with it." Maisie considered this the way she considered most things, seriously, with a small crease forming between her brows. What if she doesn't like cats? She doesn't have to like cats. Duchess lives here. Duchess is a barn cat. She lives in the barn. Maisie opened her mouth, closed it, and picked her coat up off the chair and put it on the hook. This was either a gesture of goodwill or a strategic retreat. With Maisie, Elias was never entirely certain. He poured the cold coffee down the drain and put on his hat. Cloverfield, Montana, in the winter of that year, was a town that had survived several things it probably shouldn't have. A fire in '87 that took out the hotel and half of Main Street, a bank collapse 2 years after that, and a dry summer that had wiped out 3 homesteads to the east. What it had not survived especially well was prosperity. The people who stayed were the ones who'd had nowhere better to go, or who'd sunk enough of themselves into the land that leaving would have meant leaving part of themselves behind. Elias was one of those. His father had built the hollow. His wife Clara was buried on the eastern rise. His daughter had never lived anywhere else. He drove the wagon into town with 2 hours to spare, which was not his intention. He'd misjudged the time, another small failure he added to the running list, and tied the horse in front of Calloway's feed and went inside to settle part of what he owed on account. Del Calloway was a fair man who kept his opinions mostly to himself, which was rarer in Cloverfield than it should have been. He took Elias's payment without comment, wrote it in the ledger, and then looked up and said, "You doing all right?" "I'm fine." "Harlan was in here this morning." Elias picked up his hat from the counter. "Harlan's always somewhere." "He was talking about the agency, the woman coming in." "I figured." Del set down his pen. He was 60-something, heavy-set, with a face that had seen too many hard winters to arrange itself into anything that wasn't honest. "You don't owe anybody an explanation, Elias. Not for this. I know that. But I'd say it anyway if I were you. Get ahead of whatever Harlan's planning to make of it." Elias settled his hat. "When has getting ahead of Harlan Voss ever helped anything?" Del didn't answer that, because there wasn't a good answer. Elias walked out into the cold. The platform was crowded for 2 o'clock on a Wednesday, which meant that word had gotten around, which meant Harlan had done more talking than just the general store. Elias counted 11 people standing near the depot building who had no particular business being there. Ranch wives who didn't usually come to town midweek, 2 of the Miller brothers, a cluster of younger men near the water tower who kept glancing toward the tracks. He kept his face even and stood at the end of the platform where there was space, and he waited. He had not told anyone what the woman looked like. The agency hadn't included a portrait, which was common enough. Portraits cost money, and not everyone had them made. He knew her name, her age, her stated qualifications. That was all. The train came in 3 minutes late, which felt longer than it was. Steam billowed across the platform in a great white cloud, and Elias heard the brakes shriek and felt the ground vibrate through the soles of his boots. And then the cars were slowing and the doors were opening and people were stepping down. And then Vivienne Hale stepped onto the platform. Later, he would try to remember exactly what he thought in that first moment, and he would come up empty. Thought wasn't quite the right word for it. It was more like a physical impact, something that went through him before he had time to process it. She wore a deep blue traveling coat with a fitted waist and a collar that turned up against the cold. Her hair was dark, pinned up properly, not a strand loose. She was carrying a small leather case in one hand and holding herself with the kind of stillness that people develop when they're trying hard not to show what they're feeling. She looked down at the platform, looked up at the town, and her expression didn't change at all, which told Elias that she was working to keep it that way. Behind her, 2 porters were wrestling a trunk onto the platform. It was enormous, iron-bound, dark wood, the kind of trunk that took 2 men to lift and would take 3 to load onto a wagon. It landed on the planks with a sound like something dropped from a height, and every head on the platform turned. The whispers started immediately. Elias could hear them without making out the words, the way sound worked on a depot platform in winter, voices carried and blurred and stitched together into a single low murmur. He saw Harlan Voss standing near the depot door with his arms folded, watching. Elias walked forward. "Miss Hale." She turned, and for a second, just a second, he saw something move across her face before she controlled it. Not fear, closer to relief, and then something guarded coming down over the relief like a shade being drawn. "Mr. Vance?" she said. Her voice was steady. "I'm sorry about the trunk. I know it's a great deal to manage." "It's fine." He looked at it. It was not fine, exactly. It was going to be a significant problem to load, and the wagon was not built for weight like that. But that was not the kind of thing he was going to say on a public platform in front of half the town. "We'll manage it." "I can explain." "You don't need to explain anything right now." He said it quickly, because he could see her gathering herself for something longer, something that might have been an apology or a justification, and he didn't want that. Not here. Not with Harlan Voss 10 feet away and the Miller brothers trying to look like they weren't listening. "Let's get it loaded and get off the platform." She closed her mouth, nodded once, and then she picked up her leather case and stepped aside so he could deal with the porters, and she stood with her back straight and her face composed and didn't look at anyone around her, which was exactly the right thing to do. He noted that. He didn't know yet what it meant. Getting the trunk loaded took 20 minutes, and the help of one of the porters, who Elias paid out of the money he'd been keeping for the grain order. He didn't say anything about that either. The trunk went in the wagon bed, and Maisie's old feed bags had to come out to make room, and by the time they were done, Elias's back was already complaining about the cold and the exertion, and there was a fine audience of townspeople pretending not to watch. He handed Vivienne up onto the wagon bench. Her hand was cold through her glove. He noticed that, the cold of it, and she settled herself on the bench with the leather case on her lap and looked straight ahead down the main street of Cloverfield without blinking. Elias climbed up and took the reins. "That's quite a town," she said. He glanced at her. "Most of them are just curious." "Most of them?" She said it not as a question. "Harlan Voss makes a point of knowing other people's business. He's been talking about—" He stopped, started again differently. "He was talking about the agency, before you arrived." A pause. "I see." "He does it to everyone. It's not personal." She looked at him for the first time since the platform. Actually looked at him. Not just the polite eye contact of two strangers managing a transaction. Her eyes were dark, and she had a small scar at the corner of her left eyebrow that he hadn't noticed until now, a thin white line, old and healed. "Mr. Vance," she said, "I've survived worse than a curious town." He didn't ask what that meant. He clicked to the horse and they moved off down the street, the wagon wheels loud on the frozen ruts, the trunk shifting with every bump. Maisie was waiting at the gate. Elias had not told her to wait at the gate. He had told her to stay warm and to have the kitchen clean, and he could see through the wagon's approach that the kitchen light was on, which meant she had probably done something with it, though he couldn't vouch for what. But she'd apparently found the waiting indoors too much, because she was standing at the fence post with her coat buttoned wrong and her hat pulled down over her ears, and when the wagon came up the drive, she went very still. Vivienne saw her before Elias said anything. She went still, too, in a different way. Not the cautious stillness she'd held on the platform, but something quieter. She watched Maisie the way you watch something you're trying to understand without startling it. Elias stopped the wagon. "Maisie, this is Miss Hale." Maisie did not say hello. She looked at Vivienne with the direct, unfiltered assessment that 8-year-olds were capable of and that most adults found unsettling. "Your coat is really nice," she said finally. "Thank you." Vivienne set down her case and climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help, which Elias registered. She crouched down, which put her eye level with Maisie, which was a choice most adults didn't make. "Your hat is on crooked." Maisie's hand went to her hat. "It's cold." Vivienne reached out, slowly, the kind of slowly that asked permission without asking it out loud, and straightened the hat. Maisie held still. "There. Is your name Maisie, or is that what your father calls you?" "It's my name." "It suits you." Maisie considered this. "What's in the trunk?" Vivienne stood. Her eyes went to the wagon, to the trunk, and her expression did something complicated that Elias couldn't quite read. "Things I've carried a long way," she said. "What kind of things?" "Maisie," Elias said. "It's all right." Vivienne glanced at him, and there was something in the glance, a small acknowledgement, a kind of thank you that wasn't quite a thank you, before she looked back at the girl. "Maybe sometime I'll show you, when we know each other better." Maisie seemed to find this satisfactory. She looked at her father. "She didn't say she doesn't like cats." Elias closed his eyes briefly. "Go put dinner on like I asked." Maisie went. Vivienne watched her go, and then she turned and looked at the house. Really looked at it, the way the platform crowd had not looked at it, the way a person looks at something they're going to have to live inside of. It was not a beautiful house. It had been built for function, not for looking at. The porch needed work on the left side where the wood had gone soft over 2 winters, and the front window had a crack in the lower pane that Elias had been meaning to replace since September. Smoke was coming from the chimney. The kitchen light was warm and yellow in the growing dark. "It needs some things," Elias said. He hadn't meant to say it. It came out sounding like an apology. Vivienne picked up her case. "So does everything worth keeping," she said, and walked up the porch steps. Dinner was strange in the way that first shared meals always are. Too much silence in some places and too much talking in others. Nobody certain which was worse. Maisie had done something creditable with the leftover venison stew, which surprised Elias, and Vivienne ate without comment or complaint, which surprised him more. He'd had some dim expectation, formed from Harlan's sneering and his own anxiety, that a woman in a coat like that would push her plate away or ask for something she hadn't been offered. She didn't. She ate what was in front of her and asked for water, and when Maisie knocked her own cup over and flooded the corner of the table, Vivienne had the dish rag from the counter before Elias was out of his chair. "I've got it," she said. Not sharp, just efficient. Maisie watched her mop up the water. "Sorry." "It happens." Vivienne folded the rag and set it by the basin. "When I was about your age, I knocked an entire pitcher of milk off a table in front of 12 people. The pitcher broke. It was very embarrassing." Maisie stared at her. "What happened?" "I cleaned it up and tried not to cry, and then a woman named Mrs. Aldrich told me that the pitcher was ugly anyway, which was the kindest thing anyone could have said." She sat back down. "The point is that cups tip over. It's not a catastrophe." Maisie looked at her father. Elias had no idea what she was communicating with that look. He ate his stew. After dinner, he showed Vivienne the room that had been prepared for her. The small room off the kitchen that had been, in various years, a storage space, a second bedroom for a ranch hand, and then nothing in particular. He'd put a bed in it and clean linens and a lamp, and there was a hook on the back of the door for clothes and a small chest of drawers that had been his mother's. It was not much. Vivienne stood in the doorway and looked at it. "Thank you," she said. "The trunk," he started. "Tomorrow is fine for the trunk." She set her leather case on the chest. "I have what I need for tonight." He started to leave. He was in the hall when she said, "Mr. Vance?" He stopped. "I know what this looks like," she said. She was still facing the room, not him. "The coat and the trunk and arriving like—" She stopped, tried again. "I know what the town was thinking on that platform, and I know you were probably thinking it too." He didn't answer. "I'm not what I look like," she said. "I don't know if that makes it better or worse, but I thought you should hear it from me before someone else tries to tell you their version." "Miss Hale," he said. She turned. "You made it here. You ate dinner. You helped with the spill." He held her gaze for a moment. "That's enough for tonight." Something shifted in her face, not quite softening, but something in that direction. "Good night, Mr. Vance." "Good night." He walked back down the hall and sat in the chair by the stove that he always sat in and listened to the house settle around him, the familiar sounds of timber and cold and wind, and underneath all of it, the small new sounds of a stranger learning where things were. And the talk started the next morning. Elias heard it first from Del Calloway's wife, Ruth, who came by under the pretext of returning a borrowed pot she'd had for 6 months. She stood in the kitchen doorway with the pot, and her eyes moved around the room like she was trying to locate something out of place, and she said, "People are wondering about the trunk." Vivienne was outside. Elias had heard the back door open at first light, which had surprised him. He'd expected to be the first one up, always was. And when he'd looked out the window, she was at the woodpile with the hatchet, which surprised him more. She was not splitting the large rounds, she didn't have the leverage for those, but she was dealing with the smaller pieces with a competence that suggested she'd done it before, and he had stood at the window for a moment before deciding to let her be. "The trunk is her business," Elias said. Ruth set the pot on the counter. "Harlan says she came from a wealthy family back east." "Harlan doesn't know where she came from." "He says the agency." Puh. "Ruth." He kept his voice level. "What she came here with is her business. What she does here is what matters." Ruth looked at him for a moment. She was a decent woman, Ruth Calloway, not malicious, just the kind of person who ran on information the way a lamp runs on oil. "I just thought you'd want to know what's being said." "I know what's being said. I heard Harlan yesterday." "And you're not worried?" He thought about the woodpile. He thought about the dinner and the spilled cup and good night, Mr. Vance. Not about what's in the trunk, he said. Ruth left with more to report than she'd arrived with, and Elias poured coffee and waited for Vivienne to come back inside. She came in with her arms full of split wood and snow on her boots and a cold wind behind her, and she dumped the wood in the box by the stove and straightened up and saw him looking at her. There was a streak of bark dust on her blue coat. Her cheeks were red from the cold. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I was awake." She pulled off her gloves, and the box was low. "I would have gotten to it." She looked at him with a directness that he was starting to recognize as just how she was. Not challenging exactly, but not backing down from things either. "I know you would have, but I'm here now." He handed her the coffee without really deciding to. She took it without making a thing of it. Doubt. The first week was an education in his own assumptions. He had expected someone who needed to be shown where everything was, and then needed showing again. He had expected mistakes, had expected to come home and find dinner burnt or nothing started, had expected the kind of helplessness that he'd built up in his mind around the word city lady without quite knowing it. What he got instead was a woman who learned things once and didn't need telling twice, who made herself useful in ways he hadn't asked for and hadn't planned around. She reorganized the pantry without comment and without asking permission, and when he came in and saw the tins lined up differently, he had a moment of irritation that dissolved when he actually found the things he was looking for faster than he had in years. She fixed the kitchen chair that had been wobbling since summer. She did it with a piece of leather and 2 nails and the mallet from the barn, and when he asked where she'd learned that, she said, "From a man who fixed furniture for a living," and didn't elaborate. Maisie was watching all of it. Children that age, Elias knew, were running some kind of continuous calculation, adding up evidence and adjusting conclusions, and Maisie was better at it than most. He'd seen her decide things about people, so ranch hands, townsfolk, the new school teacher who'd come in the fall, and once she decided, she didn't usually revise. He watched her watching Vivienne and waited to see which way it would go. It went, apparently, in the direction of the cat. He was at the barn 3 days into Vivienne's arrival when Maisie came in and announced that Miss Hale had found Duchess in the cold and brought her inside and given her the corner of the kitchen by the stove, and Duchess hadn't scratched her even once. "Duchess scratches everyone," Maisie said. There was the quality of a verdict in it. "She does," Elias agreed. "Miss Hale just talked to her first. She said you have to tell a cat what you want before you reach for it." He thought about that. "She's not wrong." Maisie absorbed this with her customary seriousness. "Papa," she said, "I think she's going to be okay." Coming from Maisie, that was more than okay. That was something close to acceptance, which was the currency that mattered most in this house. Plus, the trouble arrived in the form of Harlan Voss on a Saturday afternoon. He came to the door rather than the gate, which was the specific kind of aggression that frontiermen practiced when they wanted to establish something without saying it out loud. Coming to the door was a claim, was a statement that he had the right to come this close. He knocked with his knuckles, the way someone knocks when they're not asking permission. Elias answered it. Harlan had 2 men with him, Donner and a rancher named Peck from the north side of the valley, who Elias had never had trouble with before. All 3 of them had the look of a delegation, which meant Harlan had spent time organizing this. "Elias," Harlan looked past him into the house, "just came to introduce ourselves to the new arrival. Neighborly thing. She's not receiving visitors." "Now that seems unfriendly." Harlan smiled. He had a way of smiling that involved only the lower half of his face. "We just want to say welcome. This is a community. We look out for each other." "I know what we do, Harlan." "Then you know there's talk." The smile went away. "A woman comes in with a trunk that size, nobody knows who she is, nobody knows where she came from. People get curious. That's natural. What people do with their curiosity is their business. She's living in this valley now. That makes it our business." There was movement behind Elias, and then Vivienne was at his shoulder, not pushing past him, not making a scene of it, just there. She had flour on her hands from whatever she'd been doing in the kitchen, and she looked at Harlan Voss with an expression that Elias could only describe as very, very composed. Mr. Voss, she said, I've heard your name. Harlan shifted slightly. He'd expected maybe to see something flustered. What he was seeing was the opposite. Miss Hale, just came to welcome you to Cloverfield. That's kind. She dried her hands on her apron. And you've done it. Thank you. A beat. Harlan tried again. We were hoping to get to know you a little better. Where you're from, what brought you out here. The train, she said, like most people. Peck looked at the ground. Donner's mouth twitched. Harlan's eyes went hard. People have questions about that trunk, Miss Hale. Big trunk for a frontier ranch. Makes folks wonder what a woman's carrying that needs iron bindings on the sides. Vivienne looked at him for a long moment. Not uncomfortable. Something colder than that. Mr. Voss, she said, I've found that men who make a habit of wondering about other people's things generally do so because their own have disappointed them. Whatever's in that trunk is mine. If it becomes your business, you'll know. She stepped back from the door. Good afternoon. She went back to the kitchen. Elias watched Harlan put his smile back on, the one that didn't reach his eyes. You've got yourself a determined woman, he said. I know it, Elias said, and closed the door. He stood in the hall for a moment and listened to the sound of Vivienne returning to whatever she'd been doing. The quiet scrape of a mixing bowl, the solid knock of the oven door. He thought about the way she'd looked at Harlan, that cold, steady look that had absolutely no fear in it. I've survived worse than a curious town. He went back to his work. But he thought about the trunk. He couldn't help it. He thought about what she'd taken such trouble to carry, what needed iron bindings on the sides, what she'd carried a long way and hadn't shown anyone. And he told himself that it didn't matter, that it was her business, that what she did here was what counted. He mostly believed it. The blizzard warning came from the man who ran the telegraph office on a Thursday morning, and by noon the sky was the color of iron and the wind had turned to something that cut straight through wool. Elias spent the afternoon checking the barn, reinforcing the doors, laying in extra feed, doing all the things you did when you'd lived through enough Montana winters to know what they cost if you didn't prepare. He told Vivienne before he went out, and she nodded and said she'd keep the stove going, and she was at the window when he looked back from the yard, her face in the glass, watching the sky the way people watch things they know are coming. That night, the wind picked up to a pitch he hadn't heard in 3 years. Maisie slept through it. Children could do that. Sleep through the world trying to take itself apart, some deep trust in the permanence of walls. Elias lay awake and listened to the house flex and strain and hold, and he thought about the cattle in the far pasture that he hadn't managed to bring in because there hadn't been time, and he thought about what they'd cost him to replace if the blizzard took them. He was pulling on his boots before the thought was finished. The kitchen light was on. Vivienne was already there, standing at the stove with her hands wrapped around a mug, and she looked at his boots and his coat and said, Where? The far pasture, cattle in the northern fence line. Alone. Yes. She set down the mug. Then I'll come. No. He said it the way you say things when there isn't time for discussion. You stay with Maisie. Keep the fires going. That's the most important thing right now. She held his gaze for a second, that steady, measuring look. And then she nodded, once, the way she'd nodded on the platform. A concession, not a surrender. He could tell the difference. He went out into the storm. The storm blew itself out by morning, but the cold it left behind was the kind that settled into the bones of the land and stayed. Elias came back from the far pasture before dawn with frost in his beard and 2 cattle unaccounted for, and he came back alone, which was the part that mattered. He didn't say anything about the cold when he walked in. He just stood by the stove with his hands out toward the heat and let the feeling come back into his fingers, which hurt the way things do when they've been past the point they should go and are trying to return. Vivienne had kept the fire going all night. He could tell from the wood box. It was half what he'd stacked before he left, which meant she'd been up feeding the stove every hour or two, the way you had to in cold like that to keep the temperature from dropping. There was coffee on, and a pot of something on the back burner that smelled like the last of the salt pork. She came in from Maisie's room when she heard the door. She looked at him the way a person looks when they've been expecting the worst for several hours, and are trying to recalibrate quickly. "You're back," she said. "I'm back." "How bad?" "Lost 2, maybe." He pulled off his outer coat, which was stiff with cold. "Found the rest near the southern fence. Huddled up. They'll make it." She went to the stove and poured coffee without asking if he wanted it. He took it. "Maisie?" he asked. "Slept straight through. I checked her twice." She leaned against the counter. There were dark circles under her eyes that hadn't been there the night before, and her hair had come partly undone from wherever she'd pinned it, and she looked, for the first time since she'd arrived, like someone who'd had a hard night, not beaten by it, just marked by it. "I heard the wind shift around too. I thought—" She stopped. "What?" She looked at her coffee. "I thought about going after you." He studied her face. She wasn't saying it to make him feel anything. She was just reporting it, the way she reported most things, straight, without decoration. "You stayed," he said. "You told me to. And if I hadn't?" She met his eyes. "I don't know," she said, which was honest, and honesty at 5 a.m. after a hard night was worth more than most things. He drank his coffee. Outside, the sky was beginning to go gray at the edges, the particular gray of a Montana winter morning after a storm, flat and quiet and faintly silver. The wind had died. In the silence, the house creaked and settled around them, and somewhere in the walls a mouse was doing whatever mice did when they thought no one was listening. "The coffee's good," he said. "It's the same coffee." "I know." She almost smiled at that. Not quite, but close. Masam. The town's reaction to Vivienne settled into something that was less open hostility and more the particular discomfort of people who'd made up their minds about something and were finding the evidence unhelpful. She was not what they'd decided she was. That much was becoming clear to anyone paying attention. But revising a conclusion cost something, and most people preferred to wait and see if they could find new evidence for the old conclusion rather than admit the old conclusion had been wrong. Harlan Voss was the worst of it, but he was also the most predictable. Elias had known Harlan for 11 years and understood that the man operated on the principle that information was power and that anything he didn't know about was a potential threat to whatever position he was currently holding. He didn't know what was in Vivienne's trunk. That bothered him in a way that went beyond simple nosiness. The more moderate version came from women like Patrice Selden, who ran the post office and had opinions about everything in a town small enough that her opinions couldn't really be avoided. Patrice stopped Vivienne outside the general store 10 days after her arrival and said, with the air of someone doing something difficult but necessary, "We want to give you a fair chance, Miss Hale. Most of us do." Vivienne, who was carrying a package of needles and a spool of thread, said, "I appreciate that. It's just that you're not what anyone expected." "What did anyone expect?" Patrice hesitated. The honest answer was apparently harder to say out loud than she'd anticipated. "Someone more frontier," she managed. Vivienne looked at her for a moment. "Mrs. Selden," she said, "I've split wood in temperatures you'd send a dog back inside in. I've kept a fire going through a storm that dropped the mercury to nothing. I made breakfast this morning for a rancher who came home half frozen and didn't complain once." She picked up her package. "I'm not sure what frontier looks like to you, but I'm fairly certain I'm in it." She walked on. Patrice Selden stood on the sidewalk and watched her go, and probably went home and told her husband something about that woman from the East. And whatever she said, it was slightly different from what she'd been saying before. Elias heard about it secondhand from Del Calloway, who told it with the careful neutrality of a man reporting facts rather than giving opinions. Elias listened, and when Del was done, he said, "She's not wrong." And Del said, "No, she's not." And that was the end of it. That. What nobody outside the house saw was the part that was harder than the woodpile and the storm. It wasn't the work. Vivienne took to the work with a consistency that surprised Elias even after he'd stopped being surprised by her. She was up before he expected and done before he finished. And she found things to do that he hadn't thought of and did them without making a production of it. That part was fine. That part was honestly more than fine. The harder part was Maisie. Not that Maisie was difficult. She wasn't, particularly. She'd passed her initial judgment favorably on the cat evidence and had been more or less open since then. The harder part was watching Vivienne navigate what Maisie actually needed, which was something Elias himself was still trying to figure out 3 years after Clara died. You could do everything right, every practical thing, every sensible thing, and still not quite reach the specific place inside a grieving child that needed reaching. He saw Vivienne trying. He saw her being careful with it, the way you're careful with something that's already cracked. The first real test came on a Thursday evening when Maisie came home from school and went straight to her room and didn't come out for dinner. Elias knocked. No answer. He opened the door and found her sitting on the edge of the bed with her school reader on her lap and her face doing something complicated. "What happened?" he said. Not a question. Nothing. Maisie. "Jenny Hollis said my mother left us because she wanted to." He went very still. Jenny Hollis was 9 and had the particular cruelty of children who repeat things they've heard adults say without understanding what they're carrying. "Jenny Hollis is wrong," he said. "I know that." But her voice was tight. She said it in front of everyone. He sat on the bed beside her. He put his hand on her shoulder, which was what he had, the physical fact of him being there, which he knew was not the same as the right words. He didn't always have the right words. He had never been good at them, and Clara's absence had taken away the person who'd been good at them for both of them. He heard the floor creak in the hallway and then stop. He didn't turn, but he knew Vivienne was there. After a moment, he heard her walk away, back toward the kitchen. He sat with Maisie until her shoulders relaxed under his hand, until her breathing evened out, and then he went back to the kitchen and found Vivienne at the stove and didn't say anything. She didn't say anything either. She put dinner on the table, but 20 minutes later, when Maisie came out on her own and sat down and picked up her fork, she looked across the table at Vivienne and said, "Miss Hale, did you ever have somebody say something mean about your family?" Vivienne didn't look up from her plate right away. When she did, there was something in her face that Elias couldn't entirely read, a kind of recognition, old and careful. "Yes," she said, more than once. "What did you do?" "I decided that people who say mean things about other people's families are usually unhappy about their own." She picked up her fork. "It doesn't make it hurt less, but it makes it make more sense." Maisie chewed this over along with her food. "Is that why Miss Patrice Selden says mean things?" Elias almost choked. Vivienne's mouth twitched. "I think Mrs. Selden is more curious than mean. She told Mrs. Barrett that you looked like trouble." "Maisie," Elias started. "She did. I heard her at the post office." Vivienne set down her fork. She was looking at Maisie with that steady, measuring attention she gave to things she was taking seriously. "Maisie," she said, "people have said worse things about me, and I'm still here. That's the whole point." Maisie thought about this for a moment. Then she said, "Duchess scratched Mrs. Selden last spring." "Did she?" "On the nose." "Well," Vivienne said carefully, "animals have good instincts." Maisie grinned. It was the first real grin Elias had seen from her in a while, the gap-toothed grin that always made her look like herself again, like the girl she was underneath the grief and the wariness. He looked at Vivienne and found her looking at him at the same moment, and they both looked away at the same time, which was awkward in a way that wasn't entirely unpleasant. The Miller brothers came by the following week with a proposition. There were 3 of them: Cole, who was the oldest and did most of the talking; Reed, who was large and quiet and largely ornamental in most conversations; and Dex, who was 22 and had opinions he hadn't yet learned to keep to himself. They came to the barn while Elias was working, which meant they wanted to talk to him without going through the house, which meant they wanted to say something they didn't want Vivienne to hear. "We've been talking to Harlan," Cole said, by way of opening. "I know." Elias kept working. "About what?" "About the Hendricks grazing rights, north end of the valley." Cole leaned against the barn door with his arms folded. "You know there's a question about who they transfer to, now that Hendricks is selling." "I know about the rights. Harlan wants to consolidate them with his eastern parcels. He's got the county assessor willing to look favorably on a joint claim." Cole paused. "If he gets those rights, he controls the water access for about half the valley." Elias looked up from what he was doing. "I know what it means." Then you know we've been trying to find a way to counter it. If 3 or 4 of us put in a joint counterclaim, the assessor can't just ignore it. Cole was watching him. We'd need you. Your eastern fence line abuts the Hendricks property. Without you, the claim doesn't hold. It was a reasonable ask. It was also the kind of thing that made Elias's back teeth ache, because it meant going head-to-head with Harlan Voss on legal ground, which was expensive and slow and had a way of going wrong regardless of who was right. How far along is Harlan's claim? He asked. He's filing next week. Dex said it before Cole could answer, which earned him a look from his older brother. He's been working on this since October. Elias set down his tool. Why did nobody come to me in October? Silence from the Miller brothers, which was an answer. Because Harlan was talking about my finances, Elias said. Not a question. Cole had the decency to look uncomfortable. There was some talk about whether you'd be in a position to contribute to a legal challenge. And now? Cole glanced toward the house, involuntarily, the way people look at things they're thinking about without wanting to. Things look a little different now, he said. Elias understood what he was actually saying, which was that the presence of Vivienne and her unexplained trunk had changed the calculation in people's minds. He didn't know whether to be insulted or practical about it. He settled for practical because insulted didn't fix anything. I'll think about it, he said. Don't think too long, Dex said. Cole elbowed him. After they left, Elias stood in the barn and thought about the Hendricks rights and Harlan Voss and the eastern fence line and what it would take to mount a legal challenge with a ranch that was already stretched thin. He thought about what Vivienne had said to Harlan on the porch. If it becomes your business, you'll know. And the way she'd said it, like someone who had dealt with worse and come out the other side. He went inside and found her mending something at the kitchen table, the way she did in the evenings when the light was good and Maisie was doing her schoolwork. Can I ask you something? He said. She looked up. You can. How much do you know about legal claims, property rights, that kind of thing? A pause. Why? He told her about the Hendricks rights and Harlan's filing and the Miller brothers. He kept it factual, without editorializing. She listened the way she always listened, without interrupting, with something behind her eyes working over the information as he gave it. When he was done, she said, The joint counterclaim. You'd need to file within the same assessment window as Harlan, within 5 days of his filing. And you'd need documentation of your fence line abutment, recorded survey, or witnessed deed. He looked at her. Witnessed deed. Do you have it? Somewhere. I'd have to find it. She set down the mending. Find it, she said. I can help with the claim language if you need it. He should have asked where she'd learned about claim language. He made a note to ask later, and then he went to find the deed box. And in the back of his mind, something was quietly rearranging itself. Some idea he'd had about who she was and what she was doing here, shifting on its foundations without quite falling. Harlan Voss came back on a Sunday, but this time he came alone. And he came to the gate, not the door, which was either a concession or a strategy. Elias met him there. I heard you've been talking to the Millers, Harlan said. Cole Miller can talk to whoever he likes. Elias. Harlan's voice dropped, went quieter, went to the register he used when he wanted to sound like a man having a private conversation rather than a man making a threat. I've got nothing against you personally, you know that. But you're about to get yourself into something that's going to cost you money you don't have. That's my problem to figure out. It doesn't have to be. Harlan looked at the house. At the window where Elias could not see but suspected, Vivienne might be visible if Harlan was paying attention. There's a simpler arrangement. You keep your grazing access on the eastern parcel. I put that in writing. In exchange, you stay out of the counterclaim. And the Millers lose water access. The Millers have other options. Harlan, think about your daughter, Harlan said. Not threatening. Worse than threatening, because it sounded almost reasonable. You've got a new situation in that house. Things are looking up for you. Why complicate that? Why take on a legal fight that might not go your way? Elias looked at him for a long moment. 11 years he'd known this man. 11 years of watching him do exactly this. Find the thing that cost somebody something and use it as a lever. The thing was, Harlan wasn't stupid. He never offered nothing. He always gave you a version of something you actually wanted, wrapped around the thing that served him. I'll think about it, Elias said, because saying no directly would make Harlan double down, and he wasn't ready for that yet. Harlan nodded, like that was good enough, like he'd expected it. He touched the brim of his hat and left. Elias stood at the gate and watched him ride away, and felt the familiar weight of it. The weight of a small man in a small place who had made himself big by making everyone else smaller, and the question of whether this was the time to do something about it or not. He was still standing there when Vivienne came out. She didn't ask what Harlan had said. She stood beside him at the gate and looked down the road in the direction Harlan had gone. And after a while she said, "He came to make you an offer." "Yes." "And you told him you'd think about it." "Yes." "You're not going to think about it." He looked at her. "No," he said, "I'm not." She nodded once and looked back down the road. Her jaw was set. There was something working in her expression that he couldn't put a name to, something old and complicated that had nothing to do with Harlan Vance specifically and everything to do with something like him. "Vivienne," he said. He hadn't used her first name before. It came out before he'd decided to use it. She looked at him. "Whatever you're carrying in that trunk," he said, "whatever reason you had for coming out here." He stopped. He was not good at this, at the middle ground between saying nothing and saying more than he should. "It's your business. I meant that." Her face did something he couldn't entirely follow. Not surprise exactly. Something more like being heard, which is not the same thing as surprise, but is sometimes just as unexpected. "I know you did," she said. "But if there's something that's going to land on this place, on Maisie," he held her gaze, "I need to know about it." The set of her jaw changed slightly. She looked away from him, down the road, down the white winter valley, and she was quiet for long enough that he thought maybe she wasn't going to answer at all. Then she said, "There are people who are looking for me." She said it like she was making a decision while she was saying it, like the words were coming out slightly ahead of the permission she was giving them. Not the kind of looking the way Harlan Vance is curious, the other kind. He let that sit between them. "Are they going to find you here?" he asked. "I've been careful." "That's not the same as no." She looked at him then, and there was something behind her eyes that he thought was something close to fear, though fear on Vivienne Hale was different from fear on most people. It didn't make her small, it made her very focused, very still, like a person standing on ice who knows exactly what's beneath her. "No," she said, "it's not the same as no." He thought about the trunk and the iron bindings, and I've survived worse than a curious town. And he thought about what a woman ran from hard enough to become a mail-order bride in Montana and still hadn't stopped looking over her shoulder. "Tell me," he said. "When you're ready, tell me." She didn't say she would. She didn't say she wouldn't. She just looked at him for a moment with that dark, measuring gaze, and then she turned and went back into the house, and he stood at the gate alone in the cold until his hands reminded him that he was an idiot standing outside in winter without gloves on. He followed her in. The kitchen was warm. Maisie was at the table working on her arithmetic, her tongue between her teeth the way it got when she was concentrating. Vivienne was back at the stove, and Duchess was in her corner, and the lamp was burning against the early dark, and none of it was perfect. None of it was remotely easy. But it was something. It was the shape of something, at least. Elias hung up his coat and sat down across from his daughter and asked if she needed help with the arithmetic. She said no in the tone that meant yes, and he pulled the paper toward him, and they worked on it together, and from the stove came the sound of something ordinary being made, and the cold outside pressed against the windows, and for the moment the house held. The counterclaim got filed on a Wednesday, 4 days after Harlan's filing, which was the last possible day inside the assessment window, and which Elias would not have managed without Vivienne's help with the language. She'd sat with him at the kitchen table for 2 evenings straight, the deed box open between them, working through the documentation with the kind of methodical attention that made Elias think again about where she'd learned it and when. He still hadn't asked. She still hadn't offered. They'd gotten the claim filed, which was what mattered. Cole Miller had shaken Elias's hand outside the assessor's office with the relieved energy of a man who'd been holding his breath for a week. "Harlan's going to be furious," he said. Harlan was already furious, Elias said. "This just gives him a reason." That turned out to be accurate. The first sign was the lumber. Elias had an order in at Cloverfield's mill for fence posts, replacement posts for the eastern line, the exact line that abutted the Hendricks property, the exact line that made his signature on the counterclaim worth anything. The order had been placed in November and confirmed twice. When he went to collect it the first week of December, the mill foreman told him, with the careful blank expression of a man delivering bad news he hadn't invented, that the order had been redirected. Redirected, Elias said, to Voss's north property. He came in and said there'd been a mix-up, said the order was his to begin with. The order has my name on it. I know that, Mr. Vance, but Mr. Voss came in with... The foreman looked at something on the counter that Elias couldn't see. He came in with a payment, cash, for the full amount. Elias stood there for a moment. The mill smelled like sawdust and cold sap, and the particular bitterness of pine resin, smells he'd known since boyhood, and he was aware that two men on the far side of the mill had gone quiet in a way that suggested they were listening. He thought about what he wanted to say, and then he thought about what would actually be useful, and those were different things. "When can you fill a new order?" he said. 3 weeks, maybe 4. We've got a backlog. 3 or 4 weeks put him into January. He needed those posts before the hard ground made setting them impossible. "I'll take whatever you can give me," he said. "Half the number, whatever's available." He drove home with 8 posts when he'd needed 22, and he sat in the wagon outside the barn for a minute before going in and thought about what it cost. And then he went inside and got on with the day, because there wasn't another option. He told Vivienne that evening. Not because he'd decided to. It came out while he was talking about the fence schedule. Matter of fact, the way things come out when you're tired. He watched her face go through something quick and controlled, something that moved from understanding to anger to calculation in about the span of 3 seconds, and then it settled. "He's trying to slow you down," she said. "I know. Not just on the claim. He's trying to make the eastern line look unstable. If you can't maintain that fence, your deed interest in the abutment weakens." He looked at her. "How do you know that?" She was quiet for a moment. "I know how men like Harlan Voss operate," she said, and the way she said it, that particular flatness, the weight of experience in it rather than just theory, told him she wasn't speaking abstractly. He didn't push it. He was learning when to push and when to let things settle, with her. "I'll manage the fence," he said. "I can help." "Vivienne." "I can set a fence post," she said. "I've done it." He looked at her hands, which were not soft anymore. Hadn't been soft since the first week, since the woodpile and the storm cleanup and all the rest of it. She saw him looking and didn't pull them back. "All right," he said. "Weekend, if the ground holds." She nodded. And that was that. The weekend the ground held, but barely. The temperature had crept up enough to soften the top layer of soil, which made the work possible, but miserable. Cold mud instead of frozen ground, which was arguably worse because it got into everything. Elias worked the post driver while Vivienne handled the guidelines and the level, and Maisie had been recruited against her initial protest to carry the small tools and keep the hardware sorted, which she did with the resigned competence of a child who knew when she was actually useful. They worked from first light until early afternoon and got 11 posts in, which was more than Elias had expected, and less than he'd hoped for. His shoulders were done by noon. He didn't say anything about it, and neither did Vivienne, but when they stopped for water, she handed him the canteen without looking at him, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. Maisie sat on the tailgate of the wagon, eating cold biscuits and watching them with the speculative attention she gave to things she was still figuring out. "Papa," she said, "are you and Miss Hale going to get married?" Elias dropped the canteen. Vivienne caught it. She handed it back to him without expression. "Maisie," she said, "where did you hear that question?" "I didn't hear it. I made it up." "Why?" Maisie shrugged in a way that was deeply unconvincing. "Jenny Hollis's mother says you're practically already married because you live here." Elias picked up the post driver. "Jenny Hollis's mother should find something else to talk about." "That's what I told Jenny." "Good." Maisie looked at Vivienne. Vivienne was looking at the fence line with an expression that Elias could not see from where he was standing, which was probably fortunate for everyone. "Miss Hale," Maisie said, "do you want to get married?" "Maisie." Elias's voice had more edge in it than he intended. "It's a reasonable question. It's a personal question. Maisie considered the distinction and apparently found it insufficient. Vivienne turned from the fence line and looked at the girl with that particular look she had. Not avoiding, not deflecting, just taking the question seriously the way Maisie's questions deserved to be taken. "I want a home," she said finally. "I've been looking for a home for a long time. What that looks like—" She stopped. "I'm still figuring it out." Maisie absorbed this. "This could be your home," she said, "if you wanted." Elias set down the post driver. The three of them were quiet for a moment with the cold open pasture around them and the gray sky above, and 11 fence posts standing in mud that hadn't been there this morning. There was something in the air between the three of them that he didn't have a name for, something that wasn't quite anything definite yet but was heavier than nothing. "Let's finish the line," he said. They finished the line. The second storm warning came the third week of December, and this one was different from the first. Elias knew the difference. He'd lived through enough of them to understand that winter in that valley operated on a kind of spectrum. First storms were tests, calibrations, the land taking the measure of what it had to work with. The second storms were the real ones, the ones that didn't announce themselves politely and go home by morning, the ones that came in from the northwest and sat on top of you like something that had made a decision. The telegraph office posted the warning on a Friday. By Saturday morning, the wind had changed, and Elias went out at first light and stood in the yard and tasted the air, and knew that the warning had been, if anything, modest. He came inside and told Vivienne. She was already moving before he finished the sentence, checking the wood box, checking the lamp oil, going through the pantry with the quick efficiency of someone taking inventory rather than looking for anything specific. Maisie watched from the kitchen doorway with the alert, wide-eyed stillness of a child who has learned to read adult urgency accurately. "How long?" Vivienne asked. 2 days, maybe 3. "Food?" "We're fine on food. I'm worried about the cattle." He pulled his coat back on. "I moved most of them in yesterday, but I've got 8 head in the far north pasture that I couldn't get to. If I don't bring them in before this hits—" "Go," she said. He went. The ride to the north pasture took 40 minutes in conditions that were already getting worse, the sky pressing down and the wind picking up in irregular gusts that had no particular direction yet, which meant the storm was still organizing itself and would be organized and terrible by the time it arrived. He found the cattle where he expected them, bunched near the northern fence, as cattle always bunched before weather, which was one of the few things you could rely on them to do sensibly. He got them moving and drove them south, which took longer than it should have because 3 of them had decided that the fence corner was a better option than moving, and arguing with cattle in deteriorating weather was one of the less dignified parts of ranching that nobody who didn't do it really understood. He was 2/3 of the way back when his horse went down. It was ice under a thin layer of snow, a creek crossing that had looked solid and wasn't, the ice giving way not catastrophically, but enough. The horse going sideways and Elias going with him, and then the horse was up and Elias was not. And the reason Elias was not was that his left leg was pinned under something that turned out to be the horse's full weight, landing on the bank at an angle, the horse scrambling up and the leg not coming with it cleanly. He heard something that might have been his own voice. He wasn't entirely certain. The horse stood 3 feet away and looked at him with the enormous, blank incomprehension of horses. And the cattle had scattered in several directions, and the pain in his leg was a specific, urgent kind of pain that had information in it he didn't want to receive. He tried to move. His leg moved, which told him it wasn't broken, but the way it moved and what that cost him said that something in the knee or below it had been wrenched badly, and the ground he was on was frozen, and the wind had made up its mind now, and the sky had gone the color of a bruise. He got himself to sitting. The horse had wandered 6 feet further away and seemed disinclined to come back. He looked at the distance between where he was and the direction of home and made the calculation that any man makes when the calculation is bad. Not how to make it good, but which parts of bad were manageable. He tried to stand. He got about halfway and then the leg made itself hurt again, and he went back down, and he sat in the snow with the wind cutting across the open ground and thought about Maisie and thought about the 8 cattle he'd just lost and thought about all the things he hadn't finished, which is what men think about when they're sitting in the snow and the situation has gotten away from them. He did not think about Vivienne. He didn't let himself think about Vivienne, because thinking about her meant thinking about what she would do when he didn't come back, and he needed to use whatever he had left for actually getting back rather than imagining it from a distance. He started to crawl. Vivienne had been watching the sky since noon. She'd kept the stove going and kept Maisie occupied with a card game she'd invented off the top of her head, and she'd watched the light change through the window, the way light changes when a storm is serious, going not just darker, but somehow thinner, like the sky was pulling itself tight. She didn't say anything to Maisie about what she was watching for. Maisie was 11 kinds of perceptive and would have picked it up immediately, but a child didn't need to carry that until there was something to carry. Elias had said he'd be back by mid-morning. By mid-afternoon, she stopped checking the window between card hands and started checking it between every hand. Maisie noticed. Of course she noticed. "He's done this before," she said, setting down a card with the deliberate calm of a child trying to sound older than she was. "He gets stuck at the north pasture sometimes when the weather's bad." "I know." "He always comes back." Vivienne looked at her. Maisie's face was doing the complicated thing it did when she was frightened and working hard not to be. The small muscle at the corner of her jaw tight in a way that was an exact copy of her father's jaw doing the same thing. "He does," Vivienne said. "But you're worried." There was no point lying to Maisie about things she could already see. "Yes," Vivienne said. Maisie put down her cards. "So am I." The wind hit the house then. A real hit. Not a gust, but a sustained push. The whole structure vibrating slightly at the impact the way a ship vibrates in a swell. The lamp flickered. Duchess, in her corner, flattened her ears. Vivienne stood up. She went to the bedroom, not hers. The room Elias used, the room she'd never gone into unless she had a reason. And she went to the window on the north side of the house, which had the clearest line of sight toward the north pasture. She stood there for a minute looking at nothing but white and gray and the dark moving shapes of cloud. Then she went back to the kitchen and put on her heaviest coat. "Miss Hale," Maisie said, "keep the fire going." Vivienne was pulling on her second pair of wool stockings over the first pair. "Keep the stove fed. Don't let it drop." "You're going out." "I'm going to look for him." Maisie stood up so fast her chair scraped back. "I'll come." "No." Vivienne looked at her directly. "Maisie, no. If we both go, there's nobody keeping this house warm, and we need this house warm. Do you understand?" Maisie's jaw was doing the thing again. "What if something happened to him?" "Then I'll find him, and I'll bring him back." She said it the way you say things that you've decided about, that are no longer up for negotiation even in your own head, and you'll have this house ready when we get here. She went to the trunk. Later, she would think about that moment, going to the trunk in front of Maisie, in front of anyone, and she would understand that it was the moment the decision had already been made without her realizing it, that something had shifted in her, some careful wall she'd kept between what she'd been carrying and what she'd built here. She opened it. Maisie went very still. The trunk contained, layered, and organized with a precision that spoke of long habit, a set of things that did not look like what anyone had expected. Heavy rope, coiled tight, a canvas pack, a pair of serious winter boots, better made than anything available in Cloverfield's general store, wool blankets compressed flat, a medical kit in a leather case, a compass, a hunting knife, a length of oilcloth. Underneath all of that, in the back, wrapped in a second layer of oilcloth. But Vivienne was not going there right now. She was taking the rope and the canvas pack and the blankets and the boots, lacing the boots fast with the efficiency of muscle memory. Maisie looked at the contents of the trunk. She looked at Vivienne. She did not ask the question, which meant she was going to ask it later, which was fine. Later was fine. "I'll be back," Vivienne said. "Keep the fire." She went out into the storm. The cold hit her with both hands. That was the only way to describe it. Not gradual, not incremental, but immediate and physical and total. The kind of cold that had weight to it, that pushed back. She put her head down and moved into it. She'd taken the direction from the way Elias had gone that morning, and she'd taken the compass, and she moved northeast with the wind partly at her back in that direction, which was the one mercy. The snow on the ground was ankle-deep and deepening, and the new snow coming down was near horizontal, and she could see maybe 30 feet in front of her at any given moment. She'd been in worse. She knew she'd been in worse. She needed to not think about whether she'd been in worse, and instead think about the ground in front of her, and the compass bearing, and the cattle track that she might or might not be able to follow, depending on how much the snow had covered it. She found the cattle track. Barely. The depression in the snow where a lot of weight had moved was still faintly visible, and she followed it northeast, moving at a pace that was faster than careful and slower than reckless, which was the only speed available. She found the horse first. It was standing at the edge of a creek crossing, not distressed but not moving either, which was unusual enough to stop her. She approached slowly, spoke to it the way Maisie had told her Vivienne did with the cat. Tell them first, before you reach, and the horse was calm, which meant it hadn't been in anything catastrophic recently. She looked at the creek crossing. She saw the marks in the snow on the far bank, the scramble marks, the irregular pattern of weight that spoke of something going down and getting up, and then something else not getting up the same way. She crossed the creek fast, found the marks, followed them. He was 60 yards from the bank. She saw him before he heard her because the wind was wrong for sound to carry, and she saw him the way you see something that stops you for a second, the breath going short. A man on the ground, moving, but moving wrong. The crawling movement of someone who has been at it long enough to be exhausted by it, dragging one leg at a pace that had somewhere around 2 miles to go before it reached anywhere. She ran. He heard her coming and stopped moving and looked up, and his face did something she would not entirely process until later. Not relief first, but something more complicated. Something that looked like shame, which she understood. Which was one of the things she understood about men in general and about this man specifically. Vivienne, his voice was rough with cold. Don't, she said. She was already on her knees beside him, already getting her hands on him, already assessing. Don't say anything about going back. Don't say you're fine. Where's the leg? Left, knee. It's not broken. I can see it's not broken. Can you stand with help? I don't know. That was honest, at least. She got the rope off the canvas pack and looped it around them both. Not elegant, not the way a rescue professional would do it, but functional, a connection between them that wouldn't let either of them drift. She got under his left arm, and he got his right arm over her shoulders, and she said, up, and meant it, and he pushed, and she lifted, and they found some combination that was approximately standing. He made a sound that he would have tried not to make. She didn't acknowledge it. We go south, she said. I've got a compass. Just move. Don't stop. The cattle. Forget the cattle. I can't just... Elias. She said his name the way he'd said hers at the gate. Not planned, just out, carrying something neither of them had named yet. The cattle are gone. They're not here. What's here is you, and we are going south, and I need you to move. He moved. It took a long time. There wasn't a better way to put it. It was slow and hard and ugly, the way real things are when nobody's watching them from a comfortable distance. He was heavier than he looked, or she was more tired than she'd thought, or both, which was probably both. Her feet went past cold into that other thing, that feeling past feeling, and she focused on the compass and the direction and the weight against her shoulder and the sound of his breathing, which was steady enough. Labored, but steady. The trunk, he said, at some point. They were maybe halfway back. She knew they were halfway back because she could just make out the dark shape of a fence line in the near distance. The fence they'd put up together, 11 posts in cold mud, and if she could see the fence, she could find the house. Not now, she said. You had rope, winter gear. Elias, why did you have all of that, in a trunk that size? Because I knew I might need it someday, she said. Because I've always known that. Now be quiet and move your feet. He was quiet. He moved his feet. She found the fence and followed it east, which was right, and then she saw the kitchen light, and her chest did something she didn't entirely have control over, a kind of collapse of tension that almost stopped her, but she was carrying half his weight, so stopping wasn't available. Maisie saw them from the window. She had the door open before they reached the porch. She had the door open, and she had a blanket, which she'd apparently gotten and been holding, and she stood back to let them through, and she didn't say anything at all, which was the most grown-up thing Elias's daughter had ever done in Vivienne's presence. And Vivienne loved her for it in that moment with a fierceness that surprised her. She got Elias to the chair by the stove. She got his outer layers off. She got her hands on the knee, which was swollen significantly and hot with it, and she looked at him and said, "This needs to be wrapped, and you need to stay off it." "How long?" "Days, maybe a week." "I can't stay off it for a week. You'll stay off it," she said, "or you'll make it worse, and then it'll be a month." She sat back. She was wet through to her second layer of wool, and she could feel the cold leaving her slowly, painfully, the way cold always left, like it didn't want to go. "I'll do what needs doing." He looked at her. His face was still pale from the cold, and there was something in his eyes that she'd seen flickers of before, but never quite this directly, like she was looking at a thing that had been turned around to face the light. "You walked into that storm," he said. "Yes. Because you didn't come back." She said it simply. That was all. That was the whole of it. "You didn't come back and somebody had to go." He was quiet for a moment. Maisie had settled onto the floor beside Duchess with the compressed tension of a child who has been very frightened and is now very relieved and is not entirely certain what to do with either of those things. The stove was hot. The lamp was burning. Outside, the storm had arrived in full and was making itself heard against every wall. "The trunk," he said again. Quieter now. She looked at it. It was still open, where she'd left it. The contents visible, or some of them. The rope she'd taken was on the floor by the door. "I'll tell you," she said, "when you're warm enough to listen." "Vivienne." She looked at him. "Thank you," he said, and he meant it the way people mean things when the situation has stripped away the parts that are usually in the way. She looked at him for a moment with the firelight on his face, and the storm at the windows, and Maisie on the floor, and Duchess with her ears finally back to normal. And she thought about what she'd been before, and what she'd carried, and what she'd run from, and whether it was possible for something you'd run to be more real than something you'd run from. "You're welcome," she said. She went to get dry clothes, and she took the weight of the trunk's secret with her. Lighter now, somehow, than it had been before she'd opened it, though nothing inside had changed and nothing had been said. She couldn't explain that. She didn't try to. The storm lasted 2.5 days. Elias spent the first of those days in the chair by the stove because Vivienne made it clear, without raising her voice or making a particular event of it, that getting up was not something she was going to allow. She wrapped the knee with strips of cloth soaked in cold water, and then bound it firm, and she brought him food and coffee and did not hover over him, which was the part he found most tolerable. Hovering would have made him feel managed. What she did instead was simply keep going, kept the house running, kept Maisie occupied, kept the fire fed, went out twice into the blizzard to check the barn animals herself, and let him sit there with his leg elevated and his uselessness like a coat he couldn't take off. The second day was harder because the knee felt marginally better, and that made him want to test it, which Vivienne identified immediately. She was at the table mending when he shifted his weight experimentally, and without looking up, she said, "Don't." I know what you were just." She bit the thread. "Another day. I have a ranch. I'm aware. I've been running it." He looked at her. She was still looking at the mending, needle moving with the brisk competence she brought to everything, and there was something in her voice that wasn't quite amusement but was adjacent to it, a dryness, a precision. He thought about the north pasture and the creek crossing and the 60 yards of crawling and what it had cost him not to reach the door under his own weight. "The cattle I lost," he said. "You lost 5. 3 came back on their own the first morning. They were at the south fence when I went to check." He sat up straighter. 3 came back? Cattle aren't entirely stupid. She turned the fabric over. "You lost 2. That's recoverable." Nothing, but it was not the disaster he'd been carrying around for 2 days either, and the fact that it was not the disaster loosened something in his chest that had been very tight. "You checked the barn twice in that storm," he said. "The animals needed water." That was a bad storm to go out in alone. She finally looked up. "Yes," she said, "it was." She looked at him steadily, and the implication sat between them without needing to be spoken. that she'd gone out in a bad storm to the barn for the animals, and she'd gone out in a worse storm across open pasture for him, and she was apparently the kind of person who made those trips regardless of what they cost. He didn't know what to do with that. He was working on it. "Vivienne," he said. She waited. "You said you'd tell me, when I was warm enough to listen." He held her gaze. "I'm warm." She set down the mending. She didn't start with the trunk. She started earlier than that, which told him she'd been thinking about where to begin. Not what to say, he thought, but where the real beginning was, because some things have several beginnings, and only one of them is the true one. "My father's name was Gerald Hale," she said. "He built something, a trading company, Hale Meridian, started it from nothing in the early part of his life before I was born. By the time I was old enough to understand what it was considerable." She stopped. "I was the only child. He was not a sentimental man, but he was a fair one, and he decided I would inherit rather than watch what he'd built go to cousins who hadn't earned it." "He put it in writing?" Elias asked. "He put it in everything. The will, the corporate charter, the deed of trust. He was thorough." Something moved across her face. "He died 4 years ago. Influenza. It was fast." Elias nodded. He knew fast. He knew the way fast left no room for preparation, no room for the things you meant to say. His business partners were 2 men named Cowell and Draper. They'd been with him since the early years, built the company alongside him. At least that was the story they told. "They tolerated me while my father was alive because they had to. The week after he was in the ground, Cowell came to me with an amendment to the charter." She picked up the mending again, not to work on it, but to have something in her hands. It would have transferred controlling interest to a board of 3. Him, Draper, and a man they'd already selected. I would have retained title on paper and received a portion of the income, enough to live comfortably. But not to run anything. Not to run anything. Not to make any decision about anything. She looked at the fabric in her hands. "I told him no." "What happened?" "They moved to a legal challenge of the will. They claimed my father had not been of sound mind in his final years, that the provisions favoring me were evidence of a man who'd lost his judgment." She said it without heat, which was somehow worse than if she'd been angry, like the coldness came from having been past the anger a long time ago. They had a doctor willing to testify. They had records they'd curated, correspondence taken out of context. They'd been preparing it before he died. I think they started preparing it before he died. Elias said nothing. There was nothing to say to that kind of betrayal that didn't sound insufficient. The legal process would have taken years, and they knew that. What they actually wanted was a settlement, my signature on a document that gave them control in exchange for dropping the challenge. Her jaw set. "I wouldn't sign it." So they escalated. They started with my reputation, rumors about my conduct, the kind of things that stick to women specifically, that are almost impossible to disprove because the disproof draws attention to the original accusation. Then they went after my accounts, froze access to the estate assets while the challenge was pending, which was legal, technically, while the case was active. She set the mending on the table. I was living on what I'd saved personally, and that ran out faster than I'd expected because I was paying lawyers. He thought about the iron-bound trunk, and the winter gear and the rope and everything else. "How did you get out?" "I had a friend, a woman named Cecile, who ran a boarding house. I'd known her since I was young. She lent me money and didn't ask questions, which is a thing I will owe her for the rest of my life." She looked at him directly. "I knew they'd expect me to go somewhere obvious, back east to family or to one of the larger cities where I might find legal help. I needed to go somewhere nobody would think to look for a woman of my background." "A frontier ranch," Elias said. "A frontier ranch," she agreed, "through a marriage agency, which added another layer. My name is real. I kept my name because changing it felt like letting them take more than they already had." She paused. "The agency and Billings had no connection to anyone in my previous life. I paid cash. I had Cecile receive the correspondence." He sat with all of this for a while. The stove ticked. Outside, the storm had dropped to something that was merely unpleasant rather than dangerous. "The trunk," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Part of it was always practical," she said. "The survival gear. I grew up going west with my father on supply routes. He believed in being prepared for the country you were actually in, not the country you wished you were in. So the rope and the winter equipment, I've carried those for years." She stopped. The other part of the trunk is documentation. The original deed of trust. My father's letters, real letters, not the curated versions Cowell and Draper presented. Correspondence that contradicts what they submitted to the court. And she stopped again, longer this time. "And what?" he asked. "And a considerable amount of cash," she said. "The last of what I could access before they froze everything. Enough to—" She looked at him, and her expression was careful and direct and somewhat braced, the expression of someone who has decided to say a difficult thing and is committed to getting through it. "Enough to resolve your debt with Callaway's and buy the lumber you need and mount a proper legal challenge to Harlan Voss's claim and still have something left. Considerably something." The kitchen was very quiet. Elias looked at the trunk. He looked at Vivienne. He thought about the counterclaim and the missing lumber and Harlan at the gate making his reasonable-sounding offer. And he thought about what it would mean to solve all of that with one conversation. And then he thought about what else it would mean, and that second thought was the one that sat in him like something lodged. "No," he said. She blinked. Whatever she'd expected, it wasn't that. Not that fast. "Elias, not the money." He held up a hand, not impatiently. He needed her to let him say it before she responded. "I hear what you're offering, and I understand why you're offering it, but I didn't bring you out here for your money, and I'm not going to start making decisions like a man who did." "I know that. That's not what I'm suggesting." "What are you suggesting?" She thought about it. "I'm suggesting that I have resources that could help, and that using them wouldn't make either of us something we're not." She folded her hands on the table. "You're not taking charity. You're not being managed. I'm not buying anything from you. I'm telling you what I have, and saying that I want to use it for something worth using it for, because for 4 years I've been watching it sit in a trunk accomplishing nothing." He looked at her for a long time. She held the look. "The legal documents," he said. "Your case against Cowell and Draper, that's not resolved." "No. If they find you, they'll find me eventually regardless. That's been true since I left." She said it steadily, but it cost her something. He could tell. The slight change in her breathing, the way she looked at the table for a moment rather than at him. "I've bought time. I came here with the intention of getting settled enough to fight back properly, to find a lawyer with no connection to them, someone out of their reach, and reopen the case with what I actually have." She looked up. "The documentation in that trunk would win the case. I'm certain of that. I needed ground to stand on first." He understood that. That was something he understood completely. Needing ground before you could fight. Needing something solid under you before you could push back against anything. He'd spent 3 years on that particular calculation himself, in a different way. "You were going to do this alone," he said. "I've been doing most things alone for a while." "Not anymore." He said it without quite intending to, and when it was out, he didn't take it back. Her eyes changed slightly. Not softening exactly. Something more like receiving. "We deal with Harlan first," he said. "The counterclaim, the lumber, all of that. We deal with it without your money. Then we talk about the other thing. Elias, there's no reason to make it harder than— Vivienne." He leaned forward slightly. His knee reminded him not to, and he ignored it. "I know what it means if I take your money to fix my problems. I know how that changes things, and I know how it would feel to you, regardless of what you're saying right now about it not being charity. You've been owned by other people's decisions for 4 years. I'm not going to be another man who uses your resources and calls it something else." She stared at him. Her face was doing something complicated that he couldn't entirely map, something that was moving through several things quickly. "The legal case is different," he said. "That's yours. I'll help with that any way I can, but the ranch—" He shook his head. "The ranch is mine to figure out." After a long moment, she said, "You're a stubborn man." "Yes." "It's not an entirely attractive quality." "I know." Something passed across her face that was close to a smile and then wasn't. "All right," she said. "We do it your way first." "Thank you." "Don't thank me. You might regret it when your way turns out to be harder." "It usually does," he said. And she did smile then, brief and real, the kind that happened before she could decide about it. Maisie had been in her room during the conversation. Whether she'd heard any of it was unknowable. The girl had the hearing of a barn cat when she wanted to, and the convenient deafness of a post when it suited her. She came out afterward with her hair tangled and her arithmetic book under her arm and sat down at the table like she'd just arrived from somewhere else entirely. "Is Miss Hale staying?" she asked. Elias looked at Vivienne. Vivienne looked at him. "That's the plan," Elias said. Maisie nodded with the decisive satisfaction of someone who has been waiting for the adults to catch up. "Good," she said, and opened her arithmetic book. The storm's aftermath left the kind of work that multiplied the longer you looked at it. Drifts against the barn door, the water trough frozen solid, the woodpile needing restocking from the back supply, and the ongoing problem of the eastern fence, which had survived but would need checking post by post once the ground was accessible. Elias's knee kept him off the serious physical work for 4 more days, which he spent in a state of productive frustration, doing everything he could do sitting down and watching Vivienne do the rest. She was not graceful about the ranch work. That was the thing he noticed. She was capable, but she was not effortless, and she didn't pretend to be. She made mistakes and corrected them and didn't mention either. She dumped half a bucket of feed trying to manage the latch on the barn door one-handed, and she said something under her breath that made Elias, who was watching from the kitchen window, fairly certain she'd picked up some language somewhere that the Billings matrimonial agency had not advertised. She asked him questions when she didn't know something, which was not frequent but was honest. When the water trough froze solid 2 mornings in a row, she asked him the fastest method for breaking ice that deep, and when he told her, she went and did it. And when she came back, her hair was plastered with ice chips, and she looked like someone had dunked her in a frozen pond. And Maisie looked up from her breakfast and said, "Your hair," and Vivienne said, "I'm aware," and went to fix it. On the 4th day, Elias was back on both feet, slowly and carefully, and found that the world looked different from standing height than it had from the chair. Everything looked possible again, which he knew was partly just the mechanics of injury. Pain makes everything smaller, and its absence makes everything expand. But he stood in the yard in the cold morning and felt something in himself that he hadn't felt in a while. He wasn't certain what to call it. Forward-facing, maybe. Like the direction of things had shifted. He found Vivienne at the eastern fence, checking the posts they'd set together. She was working methodically, testing each one, making notes on a scrap of paper she'd folded into her coat pocket. 3 are loose, she said without turning. She'd heard his footsteps on the frozen ground. Not dangerously, but they'll need to be set again when the soil thaws. "I see 4 that need it." He walked the line beside her, testing the posts himself. "This one especially." She came to look. "You're right." She made a note. "Your knee. It's fine." "It's not fine. You're favoring it." "I said it's fine." She looked at him sideways with the expression she reserved for things he said that she didn't find convincing. He looked back with the expression he'd developed for that particular look of hers. They'd acquired a shorthand in the past weeks. Not deliberately, but the way you acquire things when you're around someone constantly under pressure. A whole vocabulary of gesture and expression that meant things neither of them had agreed to assign. "Cole Miller came by while you were laid up," she said. "I know. He left a note. He's getting nervous about the counterclaim timeline. The assessor's decision is due in 3 weeks." "I know." Elias tested another post. "Harlan's been talking to Peck. I heard from Del Calloway, trying to get Peck to withdraw his support from our side." "Will he?" "Peck doesn't owe me anything. He joined because it was the right thing to do, and right things are easier when they don't cost anything." He moved to the next post. "If Harlan sweetens his offer to Peck, then we need to make the counterclaim stronger before the decision." She'd stopped walking and was looking at the fence line, at the full length of it. The posts they'd put in together, the older posts, the whole contested border of the thing. "Elias, the documentation in my trunk." He looked at her. "Not the money, the documents." She turned to face him. "The deed surveys, the original land registration for your father's claim. I found them when I was looking for material for the counterclaim filing." Your grandfather recorded a witness survey in 1871 that establishes this fence line as the eastern boundary more definitively than anything Harlan has. If the assessor sees that, where did you find it? In the deed box. Underneath everything else, it was loose, not filed with the others. She reached into her coat and produced a folded paper, so she'd apparently been carrying it. I didn't want to bring it up while you were hurt, but 3 weeks is not very long. He took it, unfolded it, looked at it, the faded ink, the careful notation of a man who'd done this work generations before him and done it properly, the exact measurements of a boundary that Harlan Vance was currently trying to make ambiguous, his grandfather's name at the bottom, and 2 witnesses, and the territorial seal, faded but legible. Del Calloway, he said. His father was one of the witnesses. I saw that. He looked up at her. This settles it. If it's submitted to the assessor before the decision, yes, it should. She watched his face. I should have gone through that box more carefully when we were filing. I'm sorry I didn't find it sooner. You found it. He refolded the paper. That's what matters. She was looking at him in a way that she didn't usually let herself look, directly and somewhat undefended, like a door left open that usually stayed shut. The cold was sharp and the sky was that pale winter blue that comes after storms. And behind her the fence line ran clean and straight to the eastern hill. 11 new posts and the old ones, and it was not a beautiful fence, but it was theirs, in the specific way that things become yours when you put work into them. Vivienne, he said. Yes. He wasn't certain what he'd been going to say. He stood there for a moment with the old survey document in his hand and the fence at her back and the distance between them that was shorter than it had been a month ago. And he thought about what people said when they meant something, and what they said when they meant more than that, and which one this was. Come with me to the assessor's office, he said. I want you there when we submit this. Not what he'd meant to say, probably not all of what he'd meant, but it was something, and it was honest, and she looked at him for a moment before she nodded. All right, she said. They went to the assessor's office on a Tuesday, Elias and Vivienne and Cole Miller, who had brought his oldest brother's notarized testimony about the eastern boundary for good measure. The assessor was a methodical man named Birch, who wore the same green wool vest every time Elias had ever seen him, and who had a reputation for being irritating in exactly the way you wanted an assessor to be irritating, thorough, unhurried, and entirely unimpressed by anyone's urgency. He looked at the 1871 survey document for a long time. He looked at it the way Del Calloway looked at things he was committing to memory. Territorial seal, he said. Yes, Elias said. Your grandfather's hand? I believe so. The witness names can be verified. Del Calloway's father is one of them. I know Calloway's father's name, Birch said, which meant he was already verifying it in his head. He turned the paper over, turned it back. This was in your deed box? The bottom of it. Loose. Birch looked up at Vivienne, who had said nothing since they'd entered the office, and who was standing slightly to Elias's left with the particular stillness she deployed when she was watching something important. And you found it? He said. I did, she said. He looked at her for a moment with the look of a man updating information. He'd heard the talk, Elias knew. Everyone had heard the talk. Fortunate, Birch said finally, which was as close to a compliment as he apparently got. Yes, Vivienne said. It was. They left the document with Birch and walked out into the cold main street of Cloverfield, and Cole Miller shook both their hands with the relieved enthusiasm of a man who'd been certain something was going to go wrong, and it hadn't, and then he went back to his wagon and left them standing on the sidewalk outside the assessor's building. That's it, Vivienne said. He'll take 3 or 4 days, then he'll issue the decision. Elias settled his hat. If Harlan wants to challenge it after that, he can try. But a territorial survey document is hard to argue with. She looked down the main street. The town was going about its business around them, wagons and foot traffic, and the particular sounds of a small frontier settlement in winter, metal on stone, voices carrying in cold air, the distant hammer from the smithy. She'd been here 6 weeks. He'd been counting, which he noticed, and noticed that he'd noticed. Patrice Selden is watching us from the post office, Vivienne said, without changing her expression or turning her head. She always is. She's going to come over. Probably. Should I be prepared for something specific or just the general version? He almost smiled. She's going to ask about the counterclaim, and then she's going to ask something personal wrapped inside a question that sounds like it's about something else. I've had practice with those. Patrice Selden did come over, and she did ask about the counterclaim, and then she said with the air of someone who had prepared this particular question, "It must be such a comfort, Elias, having help managing the legal side of things." Miss Hale, she looked at Vivienne with the complicated attention she'd been directing at her since the beginning, which had evolved from suspicion to something more like reluctant interest. "Did you have experience with this kind of paperwork before?" "Some," Vivienne said. "In what line?" A pause. Small enough that only someone paying close attention would catch it. Elias caught it. "My father ran a trading company," Vivienne said. "I worked with him." Patrice processed this. "That's not what most people expected when you arrived." "I know." Vivienne met her eyes. Most people expected something simpler. Patrice was quiet for a moment. She was looking at Vivienne with something that Elias could not quite name. Not quite respect, not yet, but something in that direction, something moving toward it. "You went out after him," she said, "in the storm. People heard about it." "He didn't come back." "Most women would have waited." "Most women would have been smarter about it," Vivienne said. "It was a bad storm." Patrice blinked, and then, surprising Elias slightly, she laughed. A short, surprised laugh, the kind that gets out before you've decided to let it. "I may have been hasty in my opinions," she said. "You may have," Vivienne agreed pleasantly. Patrice said good afternoon and went back to the post office and would probably recalibrate her opinions tonight, and tomorrow they would be slightly different from what they'd been this morning. And that was about the pace at which things changed in small towns, which was slow and real and the only speed it could go. Harlan Voss appeared. He came from the direction of the mill, which told Elias he'd been doing something in that part of town, and had either seen them go into the assessors or had heard about it fast, which in Cloverfield meant he'd heard about it fast. He came up the sidewalk with his hands in his coat and his face arranged into the particular configuration he used when he wanted to look unbothered. "Elias," he said. He did not look at Vivienne directly, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. "Here you filed something with Birch today." "Counterclaim documentation." "Yes." "Something new?" "Territorial survey, 1871. Elias held Harlan's gaze without any particular effort or hostility, just held it. "Should settle the eastern boundary question." Harlan's expression shifted. The smallest possible shift, the kind you'd miss if you weren't watching for it. He'd been watching for it. "That'll take time to verify." "Birch's timeline, not mine." A silence. Harlan looked finally at Vivienne. Looked at her straight on for the first time in weeks, not the sideways attention he'd been paying since the day on the porch. "Miss Hale," he said. "Mr. Voss," she said. "Heard you were instrumental in some of the filing." "I helped with some of it." "Quite a skill set." He said it without the sneer, which was its own kind of signal. He was recalibrating too, Elias thought. Harlan was not a stupid man. Stupid men were simpler. Not exactly what the matrimonial agency advertised. "No," Vivienne agreed, "but I found that what gets advertised rarely covers the whole of a thing." Harlan looked at her for a moment with the look of a man who is deciding something. Then he looked at Elias. "I'll wait for Birch's decision," he said. "That's reasonable," Elias said. Harlan went on down the sidewalk, and they watched him go. And Elias was aware of Vivienne beside him, with the same awareness he'd been carrying for several weeks now. The specific awareness of where she was in a room, or on a porch, or in an open field, which was new and not unpleasant, and was probably something he was going to have to do something about eventually. "He's not done," Vivienne said. "No, but he's rethinking." Elias turned his collar up against the cold. "Men like Harlan don't stop. They redirect." "We'll be ready." He looked at her. She was looking down the street where Harlan had gone, her jaw set in that particular way, the look of someone who has been dealing with men like Harlan Voss for longer than they should have had to, and who is done with being surprised by them. The The cold light caught the scar at her eyebrow, the thin white line he'd noticed that first day and never asked about. "Vivienne," he said. She turned. "The case," he said. "Cowell and Draper. When you're ready to move on it, I know a man in Helena who's outside their network. Good lawyer, honest, which is rarer." He paused. "I can write to him." Something passed across her face, not surprise. She'd gotten past the point where he surprised her easily, the same way he'd gotten past that point with her. But something received and held. "You do that," she said. Not a question. "I'd do that," he said. She looked at him for a moment in the winter light, on the main street of Cloverfield with the smith hammering somewhere, and Patrice Selden probably watching from the post office window, and the assessor's building behind them holding a document that had been waiting 50 years in the bottom of a deed box to matter. And she said quietly, "All right, Elias, write to him." He nodded. They walked back to the wagon together through the cold, and neither of them said anything more. And the silence between them was the comfortable kind. The kind that doesn't need filling, the kind that means something has been decided without being announced, the kind that settles over people when the hard part of a thing has been named and is no longer only being carried alone. Birch issued his decision on a Friday, which was 4 days after they'd submitted the 1871 survey document, and 3 days after Harlan Voss had apparently visited the assessor's office privately, which Elias heard about from Del Calloway, who heard it from the man who swept out the building every morning. Whatever Harlan had said in that private visit, it hadn't moved Birch. The decision came in a single page, written in the assessor's characteristic style. No excess words, no room for interpretation, and it confirmed the eastern boundary as established by the territorial survey, rejected Harlan's consolidated claim on the Hendricks grazing rights, and awarded joint access to the Miller Coalition with Elias's fence line as the defined eastern limit. Cole Miller came to the ranch that afternoon with a bottle of something that turned out to be genuinely bad whiskey and an expression of relief so complete it was almost embarrassing. He shook Elias's hand twice. He shook Vivienne's hand once, and then looked at it like he wasn't sure he'd meant to do it, and then decided he had. "Whatever you did in that assessor's office," he said to her, "I owe you." "Elias found the survey," she said. "The survey was in his deed box for 50 years, Cole said. "Somebody had to look." He left the whiskey and went home, and Elias looked at the bottle and put it on the shelf and did not open it, because the thing about winning a thing like this was that it didn't feel like winning exactly. It felt like surviving, which was different. Surviving meant you'd held something. It didn't mean you were done holding it. The real response from Harlan came 6 days later, and it was not what Elias had expected. He'd expected another visit, another offer, or another form of pressure, the redirecting that he'd predicted to Vivienne on the sidewalk outside the assessor's office. What came instead was a letter, delivered through the post office, addressed to Vivienne in handwriting that wasn't Harlan's. The return address was a legal firm in Billings. She opened it at the kitchen table while Elias was at the stove and Maisie was at school. She read it through once without expression, and then read it again. Then she set it on the table and looked at the wall for a moment. "What is it?" Elias asked. "Harlan didn't write this." She pushed it across to him. "But Harlan found someone who knew someone. This is from a firm that has done work for Cowell and Draper." He read it. It was written in the language of legal correspondence, which was the language of things said without being said. And what it said without saying it was this: there were people who knew where Vivienne Hale was, and they wanted her to know they knew. And the question of the Hale estate and the corporate challenge was still open and could be resolved quietly if she was willing to discuss terms. He set it down. "Harlan sold information about you." "He sold the fact of my existence here." "Yes." She was still looking at the wall. "I always knew it would happen eventually. I thought I'd have more time." "How long before they move on it?" "A letter like this comes first. They'll wait for a response. If they don't get one," she stopped. "Cowell is not a patient man. Draper does whatever Cowell decides. If I don't respond in a way that suggests I'm open to negotiating, you're not going to negotiate." She looked at him. "No, I'm not." "Then we need to move faster on Helena." He pushed the letter back toward her. "I wrote to the lawyer 2 weeks ago. Has there been a reply?" There was one yesterday. I was going to show you this evening. She stood and went to her room, came back with an envelope. The letter inside was 3 pages from a man named Alderton, and it was thorough in the way that good lawyers are thorough. He'd understood the case from Elias's summary, had specific questions, had specific opinions, and was willing to take it. Elias read it twice. He thinks you can win. He thinks the documentation makes it winnable. Those are slightly different things. He wants to meet in person. I know. She sat back down. Helena is 4 days by wagon in this weather, maybe 3 if the passes are clear. She looked at her hands on the table, the hands that were not soft anymore, that were the hands of someone who'd been working for real. I can't leave Maisie and the ranch for a week. I'll take you, Elias said. She looked at him. You have a ranch. I have a ranch that survived 2 storms, a corrupt land claim, and 8 fence posts short of what I needed. He folded Alderton's letter. It'll survive a week. I'll ask Cole Miller to check the animals. She was quiet for a moment. He watched her working through it, the objections lining up and being considered and being answered one by one, the way her mind worked when she was deciding something real. Maisie, she said finally, Maisie can stay with Ruth Calloway. She's done it before. Ruth likes her. Ruth likes to know things about people. She already knows more than we'd like. It won't get worse. He set the letter down. Vivienne, this firm in Billings knows where you are. That changes the timeline. She looked at the legal firm's letter on the table. Yes, she said. It does. So we go to Helena. She picked up the letter from Billings, looked at it once more with the expression of someone cataloging an enemy's move, and set it aside with the deliberate placement of something she was done letting occupy her full attention. We go to Helena, she said. They told Maisie that evening. Maisie's response was to ask 3 rapid questions in sequence without pausing for answers. How long would they be gone? Would Duchess be staying at the Calloways too? And was the trip about the trunk? Elias answered the first 2. Vivienne answered the third. Some of it, she said. People who want things that belong to me. We're going to talk to a lawyer about stopping them. Maisie considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Bad people? People who believe their own reasons, Vivienne said, which is sometimes worse. Maisie absorbed this. Did they hurt you? A pause. They took things from me. Money, time, my father's company. She said it simply, the way she'd said most hard things since the night she'd told Elias. Not stripping the weight from it, but not performing the weight either. They didn't hurt me physically, but they tried to make me small enough to disappear. Did it work? Vivienne looked at her for a moment. I'm here, she said. Maisie seemed to find this a satisfactory answer. She looked at her father. Will you be safe? We're going to a lawyer's office, Maisie, not a gunfight. That's not what I asked. He looked at his daughter, at the gap-toothed, dark-haired, entirely too perceptive person who had spent 3 years learning to live without her mother and who had spent the last 2 months deciding, with the methodical care she applied to everything, that Vivienne Hale was someone worth keeping. Yes, he said, we'll be safe. Maisie nodded. Then she said, you should take the rope from the trunk anyway, and went to get ready for bed. They left on a Monday. Cole Miller came by Sunday evening and got the rundown on the animals, and Ruth Calloway came to collect Maisie with an efficiency that suggested she'd been waiting to be asked, and Duchess went in a flour sack that Maisie held on her lap all the way to the Calloways with the expression of someone transporting something fragile and important. Elias had the wagon loaded by dark. The passes were not clear exactly, but they were navigable, which in Montana in December was as much as you could reasonably ask. They drove in the particular silence of people who have been through enough together that silence doesn't need filling. Vivienne with the leather case on her lap, Elias watching the road, both of them aware of the other in the way that had become habitual and specific and no longer required any decision. The trunk was in the wagon bed, secured with rope. The iron bindings caught the light when the sun was right. On the second day, somewhere in the middle stretch of road between 2 places that didn't have names, Vivienne said, "Why did you do it this way?" He kept his eyes on the road. What way? The ranch, refusing my money, the fence posts, the counterclaim. You could have solved half of it in a week if you'd let me help differently. He thought about how to say it. He'd thought about it before, in the way that you think about things at night when the house is quiet and your mind goes to the things you haven't said yet. Because I've watched men use women's resources and call it partnership, he said. My father knew a man who married 3 times, and each time the marriage solved something specific for him, and when the solution was done, the marriage was done. He paused. I didn't want to be that. I didn't want you to be that. She was quiet for a while. And you think the difference is whether you ask. I think the difference is whether it was ever on the table to begin with. He glanced at her. You came here with almost nothing, as far as you let anyone see. That's what I wanted to build from. What we actually have, not what we could get from what you'd hidden. She looked at the road ahead. The mountains were visible in the distance, white-capped and enormous and indifferent to the entire conversation. You know, she said, you're describing something that most men wouldn't think to protect. Most men haven't watched someone not protect it, he said. She turned and looked at him. Then, directly, without the careful management she applied to most things, without the layer of control she maintained not out of coldness but out of long habit, out of years of needing to be the most composed person in any room she was in. What was underneath was not soft exactly. It was something more like real, the face of a person who has been traveling a long time and has just provisionally stopped moving. I want to tell you something, she said. All right. When I answered the agency advertisement, I told myself it was strategic, that I needed somewhere to disappear, a role nobody would expect, a situation simple enough that it wouldn't draw attention. She looked back at the road. I told myself I wasn't looking for anything else. He waited. I was wrong about that, she said. Quietly. Not as a confession, more like a correction, the way you correct a calculation when you've been given better information. He didn't say anything for a moment. The wagon wheels turned on the frozen road, and the mountains didn't move, and the cold was clean and total. I wrote to the agency, he said finally, because Maisie needed someone, and I didn't know how to be what she needed alone anymore. That was the whole of what I thought I wanted. He kept his eyes on the road. I was wrong about that too. She didn't answer, but her shoulder settled slightly against his. Not a lean, not a gesture, just a small adjustment of position that put her closer than she'd been. And she left it there, and he didn't move away. And that was enough for the moment. That was, in fact, quite a lot. Alderton's office was on the second floor of a building in Helena that smelled like old wood and lamp oil and the accumulated paperwork of people's disputes. He was a compact man in his 50s with spectacles he kept taking off and putting back on, and the manner of someone who had heard many things and had learned to evaluate them without reacting to them. He shook Elias's hand, and he shook Vivienne's hand, and he looked at the leather case she set on his desk with the attention of a man who had been told what was in it and was now verifying. She laid out the documentation piece by piece, the original deed of trust, her father's letters, 31 of them, spanning 8 years, the real correspondence that contradicted the curated version Cowell and Draper had submitted. A company ledger from the year before her father's death that showed the decisions he'd made with full cognizance and recorded intent. A letter from her father's personal physician, obtained by Cecile at some risk, that directly contradicted the medical testimony Cowell had arranged. Alderton looked at each document. He took his spectacles off 3 times and put them back on. He asked 4 questions, precise and specific, and she answered each one without hesitation. At the end, he looked at her over his spectacles and said, Miss Hale, why did you not bring this to a lawyer 2 years ago? I didn't have ground to stand on, she said, and the lawyers I could reach were inside their network. He looked at Elias. And your connection to this case? I have no legal connection to it, Elias said. She's in my home. I wrote to you because she needed someone outside their reach. Alderton put his spectacles down on the desk. The case as presented is strong, he said, stronger than I anticipated. The medical contradiction alone would give a court pause, and the ledger evidence suggests your father was making informed decisions about your inheritance within 6 months of his death, which directly undermines the unsound mind argument. He looked at Vivienne. This will not be fast. These men have resources, and they'll use them. But the documentation it's very good. My father was thorough, she said. He was. And you've been thorough in preserving it. Alderton picked up his spectacles. I'll need to file a counter-petition to the challenge, and we'll need a hearing in... He did some calculation. Spring, if we move quickly, possibly summer. That's acceptable, Vivienne said. In the meantime, the letter from the Billings firm. Don't respond to it. I wasn't going to. Good. He looked at them both. Go home. Stay out of anything that could be characterized as provocation. Let me do the work from here. They went home. Harlan Voss made one more move. It came in January, 3 weeks after they returned from Helena, and it was smaller than everything that had preceded it, which was how Elias knew Harlan was running low on options. He filed a minor complaint with the county recorder about the placement of a single fence post on the boundary line. One post, allegedly 4 inches into disputed territory, which was the kind of complaint that cost more in filing fees than it was worth, and that served no purpose except to make noise and take time and signal that he wasn't done. Elias read the complaint on a Wednesday morning and set it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a while. Then he went out to the eastern fence and measured the post in question with the surveyor's tape he'd borrowed from Del Calloway. The post was 6 inches inside his own line, not 4 inches into Harlan's. He documented it with 2 witnesses, Cole Miller and Peck, who'd stayed on their side through the assessor's decision and who turned up when Elias asked with the solidarity of men who had made a choice and were committed to it. He filed the documentation with the recorder by Friday. He didn't hear from Harlan again after that. Not because Harlan had changed. Men like Harlan didn't change. They relocated their efforts, found other leverage points, directed their energy toward situations where the odds were better. What had changed was the calculation. Vivienne in the house, Alderton and Helena, the 1871 survey in the county record, the Miller Coalition holding. The calculation had changed enough that Cloverfield was no longer worth the cost. The town changed more slowly, the way towns do. Patrice Selden was first, in the way that people who talk the most also often course-correct the most noticeably. She began saying in the post office that she'd always thought there was more to Miss Hale than met the eye, which was not precisely accurate as history, but which was accurate as a current statement, and Elias decided that current statements were what mattered. Ruth Calloway, who had taken Maisie for that week and returned her having taught her 3 card games and given her strong opinions about pie crust, had been warm to Vivienne in the specific way that women are warm to other women they've decided are worth the warmth. The Miller brothers, all 3 of them, brought a load of fence posts in February without being asked and said it was on account of the counterclaim, which was partly true and partly the frontier way of doing something decent without making a speech about it. The letter from Cecile arrived in March. It was the first contact Vivienne had allowed herself since leaving. She'd been careful, had made Cecile careful, had kept the connection dark the way you keep something precious in a place where it won't get damaged. The letter was brief and written in a hand that Vivienne clearly knew well because she read it the way you read something from someone whose voice you can hear inside the words. Elias saw her face while she read it and looked away because the expression on her face was private in the way that some things are private even between people who know each other well. She told him the relevant part afterward. Cecile had heard from someone inside the legal community in the East that Alderton's counterpetition had been received, and that Cowell and Draper's legal team had requested an extension on their response, which Alderton had told her in a separate letter meant they were worried. Worried men requesting extensions were men who didn't like their position. "It's moving," Vivienne said. "Alderton said spring." "Alderton said possibly summer." She set the letter down. "Cecile thinks spring. Which one do you believe?" She thought about it. "Cecile," she said, "has a better record." Spring came to the valley the way it always did. Not cleanly, not with any particular announcement, but in a slow accumulation of evidence, the ground softening, the creek running higher, the cattle moving differently in the pasture, the particular smell in the air that was mud and cold water, and something green underneath, something that had been waiting. Elias set the remaining fence posts on a Saturday in late March with the ground soft enough to work and the sky the clear pale blue that followed the last of the real cold. He set 7 posts and Vivienne set 4, and Maisie sat on the tailgate and kept score of who set theirs straighter, which she judged with a level she'd appropriated from the barn, and which resulted, predictably, in a split decision that satisfied no one. They ate lunch at the fence line. Cold biscuits again, which had become a thing associated with fence work in the way that some foods become associated with specific work or specific places, and Maisie informed them that when she grew up she was going to eat warm food for every meal, a declaration that Elias found fair. Vivienne was looking out at the valley from the top of the eastern rise. The light was coming in at the angle it came at this time of year, low and long, making the ordinary land look like something else. The distance between hills clean and silver, the creek glinting where it bent south, the ranch house visible down the slope with smoke coming from the chimney because Maisie had stoked the stove before they came out, unprompted, because she'd learned by now what needed doing before it was asked. "It's a good piece of land," Vivienne said. "It is," Elias said. "Your grandfather picked well." "He picked what he could get. Got lucky that it was this." He looked out at it beside her. "I used to think the lucky part was the land. Now I think the lucky part was building something on it that was worth the trouble." She glanced at him. He was looking at the valley, not at her, which made the thing he'd just said either easier or harder to respond to. She wasn't certain which. "Are you trying to say something specific?" she said. "Or are you just being Elias Vance about it?" He looked at her. "What does that mean?" "It means you have a way of saying things that are clearly about one thing in a voice that suggests you might mean something else, and then waiting to see what happens." She said it without accusation, more like the way you describe a known weather pattern. "I've been watching you do it for 4 months." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. "I'll be specific. Please. I'd like you to stay." He said it looking at her directly, in the same direct way she always faced things. "Not as a householder, not as an arrangement. I want you to stay the way people stay when they've decided somewhere is theirs." He paused. "I think this place is yours. I think you know that." Maisie from the tailgate said very clearly, "Finally," in the tone of someone who has been waiting an unreasonable amount of time. Elias closed his eyes briefly. Vivienne pressed her lips together against what was clearly an involuntary response. She looked at Maisie. "How long have you been planning to say that?" "Since January, Maisie said. "I thought you'd figure it out faster." "We're not fast people," Vivienne said. "I know, it's been very annoying." Maisie bit into her biscuit with the serene conviction of someone who has said what needed saying. Vivienne looked at Elias. He looked at her. The valley was spread out below them in the spring light, the fence line running clean and straight down the eastern slope, and there was something in his face that was not entirely comfortable, because these were not easy words for a man like him, and he knew she knew that, and she knew he knew she knew, and all of that was fine. All of it was, actually, exactly right. "All right," she said. "All right?" "Yes." She looked back at the valley. "This is mine. I decided that about 6 weeks after I arrived, I just didn't say it out loud because it seemed presumptuous." He stared at her. 6 weeks. "You're very slow," she said pleasantly. Maisie made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a vindicated cough. First sound. The hearing happened in June, in a courtroom in a city 300 miles from Cloverfield, in front of a judge Vivienne had never met, with Alderton presenting a case that he had built with the documents in the iron-bound trunk, and the letters, and the ledger, and the physician's contradiction, and Cowell and Draper's legal team doing what legal teams do when they're defending a weak position, which is making a great deal of organized noise. Elias sat in the courtroom gallery and watched, and Maisie did not attend because she was at school, and the judge was a measured woman of 60 who listened to everything and showed nothing on her face. The decision came in August. Alderton sent a telegram, which arrived on a Tuesday, and which Elias brought in from the telegraph office and handed to Vivienne without opening. She opened it at the kitchen table. She read it. She set it down. "Well?" Elias said. She looked at him. "Full restoration," she said. The challenge was dismissed. The estate reverts according to the original deed of trust. Cowell and Draper are ordered to account for all assets held during the challenge period. She stopped. Alderton says there will be further proceedings about the accounting. That could take, but you won. Yes. She said it like someone who has been waiting to say it for a very long time and is still not entirely sure what to do with the fact that it's real. I won. He pulled her into his arms then, which was not how he usually operated and which surprised them both, and she stayed there for a moment with her hands against his chest and her forehead against his shoulder, and neither of them said anything, because there wasn't anything that needed to be said that wasn't already being said by the simple fact of them standing there in the kitchen of a ranch that had survived everything the year had thrown at it and was still standing. When she pulled back, her eyes were dry. She was not the kind of person who cried from relief. Why, she'd spent too many years not having the privacy to. But there was something in her face that he'd never seen before, a kind of release, like something that had been held very tight for a very long time had let go. Cecile, she said. I need to write to Cecile. Write to Cecile, he agreed. She was already moving to the writing desk. There's something I've come to believe, watching people navigate the kind of trouble that doesn't announce itself fairly. The trouble that arrives dressed as something manageable and turns out to be something else entirely. I've come to believe that the hardest thing is not the storm or the legal battle or the man at the gate with his reasonable-sounding offers. The hardest thing is knowing the difference between what you're running from and what you're running toward, and understanding that sometimes, not always, but sometimes, you don't get to know which is which until you've been somewhere long enough to find out. Vivienne Hale ran for her life and landed in a place she hadn't chosen for any of the right reasons. Elias Vance was doing the arithmetic of survival and made a decision that looked desperate from the outside and turned out to be the most accurate calculation of his life. Neither of them chose well in the moment, strictly speaking. What they chose well was what they did after the moment, how they showed up for the cold mornings and the hard conversations and the work that didn't end, how they treated the small things as seriously as the large ones, how they let themselves be seen by someone new when being seen had cost them before. That's the thing about belonging somewhere. It's not given. It's not inherited. It's not a function of how long you've been in a place or what you arrived carrying. It's a function of what you do with your hands and your time and the people in front of you when the easy exits are all closed. Maisie grew up knowing that her family had been made from scratch, which is the only way families worth anything are made. She grew up knowing that a trunk full of rope and documents and winter gear was not a sign of something suspicious, but a sign of a person who had learned to carry what mattered and leave behind what didn't. She grew up knowing that men like Harlan Voss exist, and that the answer to them is not avoidance, but a better documented counterclaim, which was, in its own way, as good a life lesson as any. Vivienne returned to the eastern city once, the following spring, to complete the accounting proceedings. She went alone on the train and came back 9 days later and never went again. The company was dissolved by mutual agreement and the assets liquidated and the portion due. Her according to the deed arrived in a bank transfer to an account in Helena, and she and Elias argued for 3 weeks about what to do with it before arriving at a compromise that was half the lumber and livestock investment he'd refused to accept originally and half a college fund for Maisie that Elias had not thought to think of and immediately recognized as essential. The other half of what she had, she kept as her own, in her own name, in her own account, because Elias had said from the beginning that what was hers, and he had meant it, and she trusted that he meant it, and that trust was not nothing. That trust was, in fact, the whole of it. The trunk stayed at the foot of the bed in the room that was now theirs, hers and Elias's, after a quiet wedding in Del Calloway's sitting room in November with Cole Miller as witness, and Ruth Calloway crying into a handkerchief, and Maisie standing beside her father, looking like a person who had arranged something she was pleased with. The iron bindings were still on the trunk because they had always been on it, and removing them would change something that didn't need changing. The trunk was empty now, or mostly empty. The documents were filed in Alderton's office and in the county recorder's office and in the deed box where the 1871 survey had waited 50 years to matter. The survival gear was in the barn, organized and accessible, because Vivienne had kept her father's belief that you prepared for the country you were actually in. She kept the rope. It hung on a hook inside the barn door where she could see it. Elias had noticed this and not said anything about it, which was how he handled the things that were hers to decide, and which was one of the reasons she stayed. The land did not get easier. That's the part of the story that would be dishonest to omit. The part that life in that valley never settled into anything uncomplicated. There were more bad winters and more fence repairs and more arguments about money and decisions and what mattered and what could wait. And Maisie went through a period at 14 that Elias described as exhausting and Vivienne described as entirely predictable, and which they got through by not agreeing on how to handle it, which turned out to be the right approach. Harlan Voss eventually sold his eastern parcels and relocated north, not because anything defeated him, but because somewhere else offered better odds. And that was the nature of men like him. What remained was the valley and the house and the fence line and the particular knowledge of people who have been through something real together. Not the knowledge that everything will be fine, which is a thing nobody can promise and that the land would have laughed at, but the knowledge that when something goes wrong, the person beside you will go out in the storm. That's different from certainty. It's better than certainty. Certainty is something you have before the test. What they had was something you only get after. The cedar plank above the gate, Vance Hollow, its letters barely legible in the warped wood, stayed up that year and the year after. In the third year, Maisie painted over it, not erasing it but painting a new layer over the old, the letters bright and clear again, the same words, the same name, in the same place. Elias looked at it for a long time when she showed him. "Same name," he said. "Same name," Maisie agreed, "just so you can read it again." Vivienne looked at it from the gate and said nothing, which was how she acknowledged things that were complete. She put her hand through Elias's arm, and they stood at the gate of a ranch that had been through more than it should have survived, in a valley that did not care about their feelings, in a life that had been made by hand out of difficult materials. And it was enough. It was in the particular arithmetic of things earned rather than given, considerably more than enough.